The moment Marcus told me his parents were moving into our house the next morning, I felt my stomach drop like I'd been pushed off a cliff. We were standing in our kitchen in Charleston, South Carolina, the summer heat making the air thick and heavy even with the AC running full blast. He said it so casually, like he was telling me he'd ordered pizza, not that he'd invited two people to permanently invade the home we'd built together over 3 years of marriage. I'm Sarah, 29 years old, and I work as a pediatric nurse at the Medical University Hospital downtown. Marcus is 32, a financial analyst who works from home most days. We met at a friend's barbecue on Folly Beach 5 years ago, and I thought I'd found my person. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to understand me in ways no one else ever had. But standing there in our kitchen with palmetto bugs clicking against the window screens and the smell of salt air drifting through the open back door, I realized I'd married a stranger. "They're arriving at 9 tomorrow morning," Marcus said, scrolling through his phone like this was no big deal. "Mom needs the downstairs bedroom because of her hip, so we'll need to move your home office upstairs to the spare room." My home office, the space where I studied for my nursing boards, where I decompressed after 12-hour shifts dealing with sick children and terrified parents. The room with the big window overlooking our garden where I grew tomatoes and basil. "You didn't think to ask me first?" My voice came out quieter than I intended, but inside I was screaming. Marcus finally looked up from his phone, his expression genuinely confused. "Ask you? Sarah, they're my parents. Dad lost his job and they can't afford their place anymore. What was I supposed to do? Let them be homeless?" Before you judge me for what I did next, let me tell you what life had been like leading up to that moment. If you're enjoying this story and can relate to feeling invisible in your own home, please hit that subscribe button. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to this channel. The warning signs had been there from the beginning, but I'd been too in love to see them. Every Sunday dinner at his parents' house in Mount Pleasant, where his mother, Patricia, would make pointed comments about my cooking, my cleaning, my career choices. "Nursing is so demanding, Sarah. When are you planning to give Marcus children? You're not getting any younger." Every holiday where I was expected to accommodate their traditions while mine were dismissed as unimportant. Every decision Marcus made without consulting me because I knew you'd be fine with it. His father, Robert, was quieter but no less judgmental. He'd served in the military for 20 years and believed in a strict hierarchy, with men at the top making decisions and women supporting those decisions without question. The few times I'd voiced disagreement at family gatherings, he'd look at me like I was a disobedient child who needed correction. 3 months earlier, Patricia had suggested they move in, temporarily, because Robert's company was downsizing. Marcus had mentioned it to me in passing, and I'd firmly said no. Our house was our sanctuary, the one place where I could be myself without performance or judgment. I'd worked double shifts to save for the down payment. My name was on that mortgage, too. I told them no wasn't an option right now, I'd said clearly, looking Marcus in the eyes. "Maybe in a few years when we have more space, but not now." He'd nodded, seemingly understanding. "You're right. I'll tell them we need more time." Except he hadn't. He'd told them yes, and just never bothered to inform me until 18 hours before their arrival. Standing in that kitchen with the evening sun turning everything golden and deceptive, I felt something inside me break cleanly, like a bone snapping. "You told them yes," I said slowly, each word deliberate. "After I explicitly said no, you invited them to move into our house without my consent." And Marcus had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "I knew you'd come around once you thought about it. They're family, Sarah. They need us." "And what about what I needed? What about my need for boundaries, for respect, for a partner who saw me as an equal rather than an obstacle to manage?" But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, confident that I'd accepted this new reality like I'd accepted everything else, I sat in my home office with my laptop and made a plan. The blue glow of the screen illuminated stacks of medical journals and the photographs on my desk, reminding me of who I was before I'd started shrinking myself to fit into Marcus's life. If you've ever felt like you were disappearing in your own relationship, you're not alone, and I hope you'll subscribe to join our community of people reclaiming their voices. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and each one matters. I started by documenting everything. I took screenshots of our text conversations where I'd said no to his parents moving in. I photographed the mortgage documents showing both our names. I gathered bank statements proving I'd contributed equally, sometimes more, to our household expenses. Then, I opened a new checking account at a different bank and set up automatic transfers to move half of each paycheck there, starting immediately. I researched tenant rights in South Carolina. I learned that even without a formal lease, someone living in your home for more than 30 days establishes residency and can't be removed without proper eviction proceedings. I discovered that in South Carolina, property acquired during marriage is typically considered marital property, regardless of whose name is on the title. But I also learned about legal separation and how quickly I could file. The clock on my computer showed 2:30 in the morning. Outside, the cicadas were screaming their summer song, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked intermittently. I felt incredibly awake, more clear-headed than I'd been in months. I opened my email and composed a message to Jennifer, my best friend from nursing school who'd moved to Asheville last year. She'd been telling me for 18 months that my marriage looked unhealthy from the outside. Observations I'd defensively dismissed because admitting she was right meant admitting I'd made a terrible mistake. "Jen," I typed, "you were right about everything. I need a place to stay for a while. Can I come to you?" I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I contacted my supervisor at the hospital through the staff portal. We were always short-staffed, and I knew there were openings for travel nurses in other cities. Would it be possible to discuss a leave of absence or transfer opportunities? I wrote professionally. I'm dealing with a family situation that requires some flexibility. Next, I found the contact information for 3 divorce attorneys in Charleston, all women with excellent reviews and reputations for aggressive advocacy. I'd call them first thing in the morning, during my lunch break at work, before Marcus's parents arrived. By 4 in the morning, I'd packed 2 large suitcases with clothes, toiletries, important documents, my grandmother's jewelry, and photographs. I'd loaded them into my car trunk, which I kept parked on the street rather than in our driveway. To Marcus, it would just look like I'd gone to work early. I thought about leaving a note, but decided against it. He hadn't given me the courtesy of a conversation before making a unilateral decision that affected my entire life. Why should I explain myself now? At 5:30, I showered and dressed in my scrubs. Marcus was still sleeping, one arm flung over the pillow where I usually slept. Looking at him in the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, I tried to find some trace of the man I'd fallen in love with on that beach 5 years ago. But that man, if he'd ever really existed, was gone. In his place was someone who saw me as a supporting character in his story, rather than the protagonist of my own. I went to work that morning just like normal. The pediatric ward was chaotic as usual, with a summer wave of respiratory infections keeping us running. I held a 6-month-old with croup, while his terrified mother watched, explaining the treatments we'd administer. I changed IVs and administered medications and charted patient progress, all while my phone buzzed constantly in my pocket. During my lunch break, sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage, I finally checked my messages. 13 texts from Marcus, each more frantic than the last. "Where are you? My parents are here. Sarah, this isn't funny. Come home. My mother is very upset. She's crying. How could you do this? Call me immediately. I don't understand what's happening. Did you take clothes? Are you leaving me? Over this?" I didn't respond. Instead, I called the first divorce attorney on my list. Her name was Rebecca Morrison, and she had a cancellation that afternoon at 3. I took it. If you're inspired by this story of someone finally standing up for themselves, please consider subscribing. Every subscription brings us closer to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. Jennifer had responded to my email with a simple, "Come now, room is ready, love you." I'd known I could count on her. By the time my shift ended at 7, I had 43 texts, 12 missed calls, and 5 voicemails. My mother-in-law had apparently gotten my number from Marcus's phone, because 3 of those voicemails were from her. "Sarah, this is Patricia. I don't know what Marcus did to upset you, but we've driven 4 hours with all our belongings and nowhere to go. Please, can't we talk about this like adults? We're family." Except we weren't family. Not really. Family doesn't ambush you. Family doesn't ignore your boundaries. Family doesn't treat you like your feelings are inconvenient obstacles to their plans. The meeting with Rebecca Morrison was illuminating. She was in her 50s with sharp gray eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I immediately appreciated. I laid out everything: the history of boundary violations, the unilateral decision-making, the financial contributions I'd made to our home, the documentation I'd gathered. "You've done excellent preparation," she said, making notes on her legal pad. "South Carolina is a no-fault divorce state, which works in your favor. We can file for legal separation immediately based on continuous separation and conversion to divorce after 1 year. Or we can pursue fault-based grounds like desertion, though that's more complex." "How soon can we start?" I asked. "I can file paperwork tomorrow, if you're certain this is what you want." I thought about Marcus's face that morning, casual and dismissive. I thought about 3 years of slowly erasing myself, of biting my tongue, of being told I was overreacting or too sensitive or not understanding. I thought about the future that stretched ahead if I stayed. His parents permanently installed in my home office, my boundaries continuing to erode, more and more decisions made without my input until I became a ghost in my own life. "I'm certain," I said. That night, I drove 4 hours to Asheville with my 2 suitcases and my freedom. Jennifer's apartment was small but welcoming, and she didn't ask questions, just pulled me into a hug and poured us both wine. We sat on her balcony overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains as the sun set in spectacular purples and oranges, and I cried for the first time since all of this began. "You did the right thing," Jennifer said quietly. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you did." The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and negotiation. Marcus finally started trying to actually communicate, but his messages revealed how little he understood about what he'd done wrong. "We can compromise," he texted. "Maybe my parents can stay for 6 months instead of permanently." Yeah, he thought the problem was the duration, not the fundamental lack of respect. He thought I'd left over a timeline when really I'd left over 3 years of being treated as less than. His parents apparently moved into an extended stay hotel, and Marcus tried to paint me as the villain who'd left them homeless. But I'd done my research. Robert had received a substantial severance package, and Patricia had her own retirement savings. They weren't destitute. They were entitled, and they'd raised a son who'd learned to be the same way. The divorce proceedings moved forward. South Carolina requires 1 year of separation before finalizing a divorce, but the legal separation was immediate. Rebecca was brilliant, documenting every instance of financial contribution I'd made, every boundary Marcus had violated, building an ironclad case for an equitable division of assets. Marcus's attorney tried to argue that I'd abandoned the marriage, but Rebecca countered with the documentation of his unilateral decision-making and my explicit objections. The text messages where I'd clearly said no to his parents moving in were particularly damning. If you're finding strength in this story of standing firm in your boundaries, please hit that subscribe button. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us create more content about real-life situations and hard choices. 4 months later, I was sitting in my new apartment in Asheville, much smaller than the house in Charleston, but entirely mine. I'd taken a position at Mission Hospital, and I was loving the change of pace. The mountain air was clearer than the coastal humidity, and I'd started hiking on my days off, reclaiming a hobby I'd abandoned because Marcus always said hiking was boring. Jennifer and I had formed a tradition of Sunday brunch at a local cafe, just the two of us. No judgmental in-laws criticizing my life choices. I was seeing a therapist who was helping me understand how I'd lost myself, teaching me to recognize the red flags I'd ignored. My mother called occasionally, still trying to understand why I'd thrown away a good marriage. She'd always liked Marcus, impressed by his stable job and his politeness. She couldn't see what I'd lived with daily, the slow erosion of self that happens when you're constantly accommodating someone who never accommodates you. "He's devastated," she told me during one call. "He said he'd do anything to fix this." "He had 3 years to do things differently," I replied. "He chose not to until there were consequences." That was the thing people didn't understand. I hadn't left impulsively. I'd left after 3 years of trying to make it work, of communicating my needs, of hoping he'd see me as an equal partner. The night he announced his parents were moving in was just the moment when I'd finally accepted that he never would. The house in Charleston sold 8 months into our separation. Marcus had wanted to keep it, but he couldn't afford the mortgage on his own, not with his parents living with him in an apartment he'd had to rent when I refused to sign over my equity. The final settlement gave me my fair share of everything, plus a little extra because Rebecca had been ruthless in negotiations. I used my portion to put a down payment on a small cottage in West Asheville with a huge backyard where I'm planting a garden. Tomatoes, basil, and now I'm adding peppers and squash. Every evening, I sit on my back porch with a glass of wine and watch the sunset over the mountains, and I feel like I can breathe fully for the first time in years. Jennifer introduced me to her hiking group, and I've made friends who don't know anything about my marriage or my divorce, who just know me as Sarah, the nurse who loves bad puns and can identify medicinal plants on the trail. I'm not dating yet. I'm not sure I'm ready, and I'm learning that being alone is different from being lonely. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I overreacted. If I should have tried harder, gone to marriage counseling, given Marcus another chance to understand what he'd done wrong. But then I remember the feeling of standing in that kitchen, being told that decisions about my own home would be made without my input, and I know I made the right choice. The thing about boundaries is that they're meaningless if you're not willing to enforce them. I'd spent 3 years setting boundaries that Marcus walked right over, and I'd let him because I loved him, because I wanted to be understanding, because I didn't want to be difficult. But being difficult is sometimes another word for having standards. A year after that night in Charleston, my divorce was finalized. I took myself out to a nice dinner at a restaurant downtown, ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu, and toasted to myself. To the woman who'd finally chosen herself. To the nurse who'd saved her own life this time. I've heard through mutual friends that Marcus is dating again, someone younger who apparently doesn't challenge him the way I did toward the end. His parents moved back to Mount Pleasant once they got their finances sorted out. They'd never really needed to move in with us. They just wanted to, and Marcus had been too weak to say no to them and too dismissive to consider my feelings. I don't hate him. That's the surprising part. I look back on our marriage like it was something that happened to a different person. Someone who'd lost herself so gradually she didn't notice until it was almost too late. I'm grateful to her for finally waking up, for packing those suitcases, for driving away. Work has been fulfilling in ways it wasn't before. When you're not exhausted from fighting battles at home, you have more energy for everything else. I've taken on additional responsibilities at the hospital, mentoring new nurses, and I'm considering going back to school for my nurse practitioner certification. The future feels open in a way it hasn't in years. Last month, I ran into one of Marcus's cousins at a conference in Charlotte. She pulled me aside during a break and said something that stayed with me. "I always thought you were too good for him," she said quietly. "The way he'd talk over you at family gatherings, the way Patricia treated you, and he'd just let it happen. I'm glad you got out." It was validating in a way I hadn't expected. To know that other people had seen what I'd thought I was imagining. To know that my reality had been real, even when everyone acted like I was being unreasonable. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever had to make a hard choice to protect your peace, please subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of people who understand that sometimes love isn't enough, that respect and partnership matter just as much. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers by hitting that button. The garden in my backyard is thriving. The tomatoes came in heavy this year, and I've been making sauce and salsa, canning them for winter. There's something deeply satisfying about growing your own food, about nurturing something and watching it flourish. It feels metaphorical, like I'm doing the same thing for myself. I've started writing in a journal, something my therapist suggested. Mostly I write about the small joys, the perfect cup of coffee in the morning, the patient who finally got to go home after weeks in the hospital, the way the mountains look when they're covered in morning mist. But sometimes I write about the marriage, processing what happened, understanding my role in letting things get as bad as they did. Because I did play a role. Not in Marcus's choices, those were his own, but in accepting unacceptable behavior for so long, in believing that being a good partner meant constantly accommodating, never causing conflict, shrinking myself to avoid problems. I'm learning that real partnership requires two people willing to respect each other's boundaries, to communicate honestly, to see each other as equals. Jennifer says I'm different now. Lighter, she says. More like the person I was in nursing school before I met Marcus. I think she's right. There's a confidence I'm rebuilding, a sense of self I'd lost somewhere along the way. Next month, I'm planning a solo trip to Colorado to hike part of the Rockies. Old Sarah never would have done that. She would have worried about going alone, about what people would think, about taking time off work. New Sarah just booked the flights and the hotel and started training for the altitude. The divorce taught me that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Not in a cynical way, but in an empowering one. I can trust myself to make hard decisions. I can trust myself to enforce my boundaries. I can trust myself to walk away when something isn't serving me, even when it's painful, even when people don't understand. Marcus sent me an email a few weeks ago, his first contact since the divorce was finalized. It was long and rambling, clearly written late at night. He said he'd been doing therapy, that he was starting to understand what he'd done wrong. He said he wished he'd listened to me, really listened, before it was too late. I appreciated the sentiment, but I didn't respond. That chapter of my life is closed. Whatever growth he's experiencing now, I'm glad for him, but it doesn't change anything for us. Some damage can't be repaired, some relationships can't be salvaged, and that's okay. My cottage feels like home in a way that house in Charleston never quite did, even though I'd picked out the paint colors and the furniture. Maybe because this space is entirely mine. No compromises, no accommodations for someone else's preferences that somehow always took priority over my own. The pediatric ward keeps me busy and fulfilled. Last week, a teenager I'd cared for during a difficult hospitalization came back to visit, healthy and thriving. She'd brought me flowers and a card thanking me for being kind during a scary time. Those moments remind me why I became a nurse, why this work matters. I think about that night often. The moment Marcus casually announced his parents were moving in, and the moment I decided I was done. It would have been so easy to just go along with it, like I'd gone along with everything else. To move my office upstairs, to accommodate his parents, to continue shrinking myself to fit into the space his family left for me. But something in me finally broke, or maybe finally woke up. Either way, I found the strength to choose myself, to pack those suitcases, to drive away from a life that was killing me slowly. People ask if I regret getting married, if I feel like I wasted 3 years. I don't. Those years taught me what I won't accept, what I need in a partner, who I am when I'm not trying to be who someone else wants me to be. Expensive lessons, but valuable ones. The mountains are beautiful this time of year, the leaves just starting to turn. I've taken up photography, capturing the landscapes around my cottage, the way light filters through the trees in my backyard. It's another thing I'd stopped doing, another piece of myself I'm reclaiming. Jennifer and I talk about starting a hiking blog, sharing trails and tips for women who want to explore the outdoors. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But I love that my life feels full of possibilities now, instead of narrow and constrained. My family is slowly coming around. My mother finally admitted that she never saw Marcus really listen to me, really consider my opinions. My sister confessed she'd been worried about me but didn't know how to say anything. It's healing, in a way, to have them acknowledge that my reality was real. Please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and each subscription helps us share more stories about difficult decisions, personal growth, and choosing yourself. Your support means everything. The legal battles are completely over now. Everything is divided. All ties are cut. I kept my grandmother's engagement ring, which Marcus had tried to claim was marital property, despite it being family jewelry from before we met. Rebecca shut that down quickly. I look at that ring sometimes, the one I'll pass down to my niece someday. It survived my grandmother's 50-year marriage, outlasted my own failed attempt, and it will continue long after I'm gone. There's something comforting about that continuity, about objects that persist while relationships fall apart and rebuild. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd just moved my office upstairs and let Patricia and Robert take over the downstairs. They probably would have never left. Patricia would have reorganized my kitchen and criticized my housekeeping. Robert would have made comments about my work schedule and suggested Marcus needed a wife who was home more. I would have become smaller and smaller until I disappeared entirely. Instead, I'm here, in my cottage with my garden and my photographs and my hard-won peace. I'm hiking mountains and making new friends and rediscovering who I am when I'm not performing for someone else's family. I'm learning what I like, what I want, who I want to be. The dating apps sit on my phone, unopened. My friends keep suggesting I get back out there, but I'm not ready. I'm still learning to be alone without being lonely, still rebuilding the self I lost. When I'm ready for partnership again, I'll know. And I'll know what to look for, what red flags to never ignore again. Marcus wasn't a monster. That's important to say. He wasn't abusive in obvious ways. He didn't yell or hit or cheat. But he erased me slowly, through 1,000 small dismissals and unilateral decisions and assumptions that his needs mattered more than mine. And I let him, until I couldn't anymore. The most powerful thing I've learned is that you can love someone and still need to leave them. That loving yourself more isn't selfish. It's necessary. That you don't need a dramatic reason. You don't need to wait until things get unbearable. You can leave simply because you're not happy, because the relationship isn't serving you, because you deserve better. My cottage is quiet tonight. Just the sound of crickets and the distant train whistle and my own breathing. I'm reading a novel Jennifer recommended, drinking herbal tea, completely content with my own company. This is what peace feels like, I realize. This is what it feels like to be home in your own life. Looking back, I wish I could tell younger Sarah what was coming. The nurse who met a charming man at a beach barbecue and fell so completely. I'd tell her to pay attention to how he handles disagreement, to notice if he really listens, or just waits for his turn to talk. I'd tell her that love without respect is just a pretty trap, but maybe she wouldn't have listened. Maybe she needed to learn these lessons the hard way, through 3 years of marriage, and one decisive night, and a long journey back to herself. Maybe we all have to learn some things through experience, rather than warning. The divorce papers are filed away in a folder in my office, along with all the other legal documents. I don't look at them often. They're just paperwork, documentation of an ending. The real story is the new beginning, the life I'm building piece by piece. Work called today asking if I'd be interested in a leadership position, managing the pediatric unit. Old Sarah would have hesitated, worried about being too ambitious, about taking on too much. New Sarah said yes immediately. Why not? I'm good at my job. I care about our patients. I have ideas for improvements. I deserve the opportunity. That's the shift. Right there. Moving from asking permission to claiming space. From shrinking to expanding. From accommodating to advocating for myself. The garden needs weeding this weekend. The guest room needs painting. I'm thinking about adopting a cat from the local shelter. Small decisions that are entirely mine, no negotiation required. It's liberating in ways I'm still discovering. If Marcus's announcement about his parents taught me anything, it's that you can't control other people's choices, only your own response. He chose to prioritize his parents over his wife. I chose to prioritize my well-being over a marriage that was destroying me. We both made choices, and we both live with the consequences. Before I end this, I want to remind you one more time to subscribe if this story touched you. We're building a community here, a space where people can hear stories about difficult decisions and know they're not alone. Help us reach that 1,000 subscriber goal by clicking the subscribe button right now. The moon is rising over the mountains, huge and orange. Tomorrow I'll wake up in my cottage, make coffee in my kitchen, maybe work in my garden before my shift at the hospital. It's a simple life, quieter than what I had before, but it's mine, completely, authentically, unapologetically mine. That night in Charleston, when Marcus told me his parents were moving in, when I felt everything crystallize into clarity, I knew exactly what I had to do. Not because I'd planned it, but because somewhere deep down, I'd been preparing for that moment for a long time. The moment when I'd finally choose myself. And I did. And I'd do it again. Plus, I'll continue the story with an additional 20 Uozaran characters, maintaining the same narrative voice and style. The first year after the divorce was finalized felt like learning to walk again after a long illness. Every decision, no matter how small, required conscious effort. What to eat for dinner when no one else's preferences mattered. What color to paint the living room walls without needing approval. Whether to spend Saturday mornings sleeping in or hiking, with no guilt about abandoning a partner. Jennifer noticed the changes before I did. We were having coffee on her balcony one Sunday morning, the October air crisp with the promise of autumn, when she said something that stopped me mid-sip. "You laugh differently now," she observed, watching me over the rim of her mug. "It's genuine. Before, even when you laughed, there was this tension in your shoulders, like you were waiting for someone to tell you the joke wasn't that funny." I thought about that for days afterward. Had I really been that controlled, that diminished? The answer, uncomfortably, was yes. I'd learned to modulate everything, to gauge Marcus's mood before expressing my own, to make myself smaller and quieter, and less demanding. It had become so automatic, I hadn't even noticed I was doing it. The therapy sessions were helping me understand the patterns. My therapist, Dr. Chen, was a woman in her 60s who specialized in relationship trauma and identity reconstruction. She never used the word abuse to describe my marriage, but she talked about coercive control, about how power imbalances manifest in subtle ways, about the slow erosion of self that happens when one person's reality consistently takes precedence over another's. "You weren't beaten or screamed at," she said during one session, her office filled with plants and afternoon sunlight. "But you were systematically taught that your needs were less important, your boundaries negotiable, your voice optional. That's a different kind of harm, but it's harm nonetheless." I started attending a support group for divorced women that met Thursday evenings at a community center in downtown Asheville. The first night, I sat in a circle of folding chairs with 7 other women ranging from their late 20s to their 60s, all of us clutching coffee cups like lifelines, and I felt simultaneously exposed and understood. Their stories were different from mine in specifics, but similar in essence. Claire's ex-husband had made every major financial decision without consulting her, leaving her completely in the dark about their actual economic situation. Deborah's had slowly isolated her from friends and family through constant criticism and manufactured crises. Yolanda's had simply checked out emotionally while expecting her to maintain the facade of a perfect marriage. It's the invisibility that hurt most. Claire said that first night, tears streaming down her face. I was right there, every day, managing the household and raising the kids and working part-time, and he acted like I was furniture, like my opinions were background noise. I understood that viscerally, the invisibility, the being present but not seen, heard but not listened to. The group became a lifeline. Every Thursday evening we'd gather and share our weeks, our struggles, our small victories. When I got the promotion to unit manager, they celebrated like it was their own achievement. When I had a panic attack in the grocery store because I ran into Marcus's mother near the produce section, they talked me through it without judgment. Patricia hadn't recognized me at first. I'd lost 15 pounds without trying. Stress and hiking burning through the weight I'd carried during my marriage. My hair was different too, cut shorter and dyed with auburn highlights Jennifer had convinced me to try. I'd been examining avocados when I heard her voice. "Sarah? Is that you?" I'd frozen, my hand still on an avocado, every muscle in my body tensing for confrontation. Patricia looked older, more fragile than I remembered. She was alone, her shopping cart nearly empty. If you're connecting with Sarah's journey of rediscovering herself, please take a moment to subscribe. We're building something special here, a community where people can share their truths without judgment. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers by clicking that button now. "Hello, Patricia," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness? Regret? Resentment? Maybe all three. "You look well," she said finally. "Mountain living agrees with you." There was so much I could have said. About how her son's lack of boundaries had destroyed our marriage. About how her expectations and judgments had contributed to my unhappiness. About how she'd raised a man who didn't know how to see women as equals. But standing there in the grocery store with fluorescent lights humming overhead and elevator music playing, I realized I didn't need to say any of it. "I am well," I replied. "I hope you are too." I walked away before she could respond, my heart pounding, but my head high. Later, I'd realized that was the moment I truly moved on. Not when I packed my bags, not when I signed the divorce papers, but when I could stand face to face with someone from that part of my life and feel nothing but mild discomfort rather than rage or guilt. The hospital promotion came with new challenges and responsibilities. Managing a team of nurses meant navigating personalities, mediating conflicts, advocating for staff needs with administration. I discovered I was good at it, better than I'd expected. Years of managing Marcus's moods and his family's expectations had given me skills I could now use productively. One of my nurses, a recent graduate named Amanda, reminded me of younger me. Brilliant, compassionate, but constantly apologizing, constantly deferring, constantly making herself smaller. I watched her in staff meetings, how she'd start to offer an idea, then trail off if anyone looked skeptical. How she'd volunteer for the worst shifts to avoid disappointing anyone. I pulled her aside one day after a particularly egregious example of self-diminishment. "Amanda," I said gently, "why do you apologize before sharing your clinical observations?" She looked confused. "I don't want to seem presumptuous. Everyone else has more experience." "Your observations are valid regardless of your experience level. You see things others might miss precisely because you're new and still questioning everything. Stop apologizing for taking up space." It was advice I wished someone had given me 10 years earlier. Maybe I wouldn't have listened then either, but maybe it would have planted a seed. The cottage renovations were progressing slowly. I'd hired a local contractor to expand the back deck and install French doors from the bedroom. Every decision was mine alone, and I savored that autonomy even as it sometimes felt overwhelming. No one to consult, but also no one to override my choices or make me justify my preferences. I chose deep blue paint for the bedroom, a color Marcus would have vetoed as too dark. I installed open shelving in the kitchen even though it meant my dishes would be visible, something Patricia had called tacky and lower class. I bought art from local galleries, bold, colorful pieces that made me happy, even though they didn't match in any traditional sense. The house was becoming a physical manifestation of reclaiming myself. Each choice, each small act of self-expression, was a declaration of independence. Dating remained theoretical. My friends kept encouraging me, setting up profiles on apps, suggesting men they knew. I'd go through the motions occasionally, swipe through profiles, match with someone who seemed interesting. But the thought of actually meeting up, of making small talk and navigating attraction and possibly becoming vulnerable again, exhausted me before I even began. "You don't have to date until you're ready," Dr. Chen said when I brought it up in therapy. "There's no timeline for healing. You spent 3 years in a relationship that required you to constantly manage someone else's emotions. It makes sense that you'd need time to just be yourself without performing for anyone." That word, performing, resonated. So much of my marriage had been performance. The good wife, the accommodating daughter-in-law, the woman who could handle anything with a smile. I'd been performing so long I'd forgotten what authenticity felt like. The hiking had become meditative, almost spiritual. I'd joined Jennifer's group, a collection of women ranging from their 20s to their 50s, who explored different trails every weekend. We'd drive to trailheads in the Pisgah National Forest, or along the Blue Ridge Parkway, spending hours climbing mountains and traversing ridgelines, talking about everything and nothing. These women knew nothing about my divorce except the bare facts. I was Sarah, the nurse who'd moved from Charleston, who loved the outdoors and could identify medicinal plants. They accepted that surface version without probing for deeper stories, and there was freedom in that anonymity. But gradually, naturally, deeper connections formed. Lisa, a teacher who'd been divorced twice, understood the specific pain of loving someone who couldn't see you. Karen, who'd never married, offered a perspective on choosing yourself that wasn't rooted in reaction to partnership. Maya, happily married for 20 years, showed me what healthy partnership actually looked like, the constant negotiation and mutual respect I'd never experienced. One Saturday in November, we were hiking Max Patch, a bald mountain with panoramic views. The grass was golden brown, the sky impossibly blue, and you could see mountains extending in every direction like waves. We sat on the summit eating lunch, the wind whipping our hair, when Lisa turned to me with sudden intensity. "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded, mouth full of trail mix. "Do you ever regret leaving, even knowing what you know now?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Sometimes I regret the time I spent trying to make it work when it was never going to. But leaving? No. That's the one thing I don't regret. She smiled, understanding in her eyes. Good, because I regret staying as long as I did in both my marriages. The leaving is never the mistake. It's the staying when you know you should go. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. The staying when you know you should go. How many people were trapped in that moment right now, knowing they needed to leave but terrified of the aftermath? How many were making the same calculations I'd made that night in Charleston, weighing the fear of the unknown against the certainty of continued unhappiness? Before we continue, if you're finding value in this story and seeing pieces of your own journey reflected here, please subscribe to this channel. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and each one helps us create more content about real experiences and authentic growth. Click that subscribe button and join our community. The holidays approached with a mixture of relief and melancholy. My first Thanksgiving and Christmas without Marcus, without his family's elaborate traditions and expectations. Jennifer invited me to her family's celebration, but I declined. I needed to prove to myself I could be alone without being lonely. I volunteered for the holiday shifts at the hospital, covering for colleagues who had young children and family obligations. There was something meaningful about spending the holidays caring for sick children, reminding myself of purpose beyond personal drama. On Christmas Eve, I worked a 12-hour shift, then drove home to my cottage as snow began to fall. Asheville rarely got significant snow, and watching the flakes drift down in the darkness felt magical. I made hot chocolate, built a fire in the fireplace, and curled up with a book. My phone buzzed around 10. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, the first time he'd contacted me since that rambling email months ago. Merry Christmas, Sarah. I hope you're well. I'm sorry for everything. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond, to acknowledge his apology, to offer some form of closure or forgiveness. But another part, the part I was learning to trust, knew that engaging would only open doors I'd worked hard to close. I deleted the message without responding and returned to my book. The new year arrived with possibility. I'd been in Asheville for a year and a half, in my cottage for almost a year. The gardens I'd planted were dormant, but would burst back to life in spring. The life I was building felt increasingly solid, increasingly mine. Work had become more than just a job. I was implementing new protocols in the pediatric unit, advocating for better staffing ratios, mentoring younger nurses like Amanda. I'd found my voice professionally in a way I'd never managed personally during my marriage. One of the hospital administrators, Dr. Patricia Williams, took notice. She called me to her office one Friday afternoon, and I went with slight trepidation, unsure if I'd overstepped somehow. "Sarah," she said, gesturing for me to sit, "I've been impressed with the changes you've made in pediatrics. Patient satisfaction is up, staff retention has improved, and your team seems genuinely happy. That's rare." I felt pride bloom in my chest. "Thank you. I have a great team." "I want to offer you an opportunity," she continued. "We're opening a new pediatric wing next year, and we need someone to oversee the project from a nursing perspective. It would be a significant time commitment, probably 50 to 60 hours a week for the next 6 months, but it's a chance to shape something from the ground up." Old Sarah would have hesitated, worried about work-life balance, about taking on too much, about what people would think. New Sarah grinned and said, "When do I start?" The project consumed me in the best possible way. I worked with architects and designers, planning layouts that would maximize efficiency while minimizing stress for young patients and their families. I consulted with child psychologists about color schemes and decor. I researched best practices from pediatric hospitals across the country. The long hours meant less time for hiking and socializing, but I didn't mind. I was building something meaningful, using my skills and experience to create a space that would serve families for decades. It felt purposeful in a way my marriage never had. Jennifer worried I was becoming a workaholic, substituting one form of avoidance for another. Maybe she was right, but this felt different. I wasn't working to escape unhappiness. I was working because I'd found something worth my energy and passion. The support group continued to ground me. Even when I was exhausted from 60-hour weeks, I made it to those Thursday evening sessions. The women there understood the ongoing nature of recovery, how healing wasn't linear, how you could feel strong and independent one day and completely lost the next. Deborah, whose ex-husband had isolated her, shared in February that she'd reconnected with her estranged sister. They'd met for coffee, tentatively rebuilding a relationship her ex had systematically destroyed through manipulation and lies. Watching her cry happy tears as she described that coffee date reminded me that healing created space for reconnection, not just with ourselves, but with others. My relationship with my own family was improving too. My mother had finally stopped bringing up Marcus, stopped suggesting I should have tried harder. My sister visited in March, staying in my guest room for a long weekend, and we hiked and talked and laughed in ways we hadn't since before my marriage. "You're different," she said our last morning, helping me make breakfast. "You seem present, like you're actually here instead of always thinking about what you should be doing or who you should be pleasing." She was right. I'd spent so much of my marriage in my head, constantly calculating, always anticipating Marcus's reactions and adjusting accordingly. Now I could just exist in moments without that constant background noise of anxiety. Spring arrived with an explosion of color. The gardens burst back to life, and I spent weekends planting new varieties, expanding the beds, creating a small herb garden near the kitchen door. There was deep satisfaction in working with soil and seeds, in nurturing growth, in literally cultivating life. One Saturday in April, I was weeding the vegetable garden when my neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret who I'd spoken with occasionally, came over with a tray of seedlings. "Tomatoes," she said, offering them. "I always start too many. You'll give them a good home." And we ended up talking for over an hour, sitting on my back deck with iced tea while she shared gardening wisdom accumulated over 70 years. She'd been widowed young, she told me, and never remarried. "People felt sorry for me," she said, "being alone for so long. But I wasn't lonely. I had my garden, my work, my friends. Not everyone needs a partner to have a full life." It was permission I hadn't known I needed. The acknowledgement that being single wasn't a problem to solve or a temporary state to endure, but potentially a choice, a valid way of living. The pediatric wing project was nearing completion. Walking through the nearly finished space in May, I felt overwhelming pride. The patient rooms were designed to maximize natural light while allowing for privacy. We'd created family spaces where siblings could play, while parents stayed with hospitalized children. We'd consulted with child life specialists to make every aspect less intimidating. This was what I'd given up my marriage for. Not specifically this project, but the space and energy to contribute meaningfully to something beyond maintaining a relationship that depleted me. The freedom to say yes to opportunities without negotiating or compromising or feeling guilty. If Sarah's journey toward reclaiming her purpose and passion resonates with you, please consider subscribing. We're building a community of people supporting each other through difficult transitions and celebrating personal growth. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers by clicking that button. The wing opened in June with a small ceremony. Administrators gave speeches. Donors were thanked. But I felt the real victory when the first patient was admitted. A 6-year-old girl with leukemia, frightened and brave in equal measure, and her exhausted parents trying to hold it together. I showed them to their room, pointing out the pull-out bed for parents, the toys and books we'd stocked, the window that looked out on a small garden designed specifically for the wing. The mother started crying, overwhelmed by small kindnesses in the midst of her nightmare. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for thinking of families, not just patients." That moment crystallized everything. This was what I was meant to do, where I was meant to be. And I'd almost missed it, almost stayed trapped in a marriage that diminished me, that kept me so exhausted with emotional management there was nothing left for genuine purpose. Summer settled in, hot and humid even in the mountains. The hiking group scaled back to early morning starts to avoid afternoon heat. I'd become stronger physically, capable of longer and more challenging trails, but also stronger mentally, more confident in my decisions and judgments. Amanda, my young nurse mentee, had blossomed under encouragement. She'd started speaking up in meetings, advocating for her patients, even disagreeing with doctors when clinical situations warranted. Watching her grow into her competence and confidence felt like tending another kind of garden. "You changed my life," she told me one day after a particularly successful patient advocacy situation. "You taught me it's okay to take up space." I thought about Patricia in that grocery store, about all the ways Marcus's family had taught me to shrink, about how I'd internalized those messages so completely I'd almost disappeared. Teaching Amanda the opposite lesson felt like a form of resistance, of claiming victory over all those years of diminishment. The cottage felt completely like home now. Every room reflected my taste, my choices, my personality. Friends gathered on the back deck for impromptu dinners. The garden produced more vegetables than I could use, so I shared with neighbors and coworkers. I'd created a life that felt authentic and sustainable. Dating still hadn't happened, and I was increasingly okay with that. Dr. Chen and I had talked through my hesitation, unpacking the difference between healthy caution and avoidance rooted in fear. I wasn't avoiding partnership because I was afraid. I was choosing solitude because it felt right for this season of my life. "You're allowed to be content alone," Dr. Chen said during our session in July. "You're allowed to build a life that doesn't include romantic partnership. And you're allowed to change your mind later if that feels right. There's no correct path here." The second anniversary of leaving Marcus passed almost unnoticed. I realized the date had come and gone only when Jennifer mentioned it. 2 years, she said. "Can you believe it?" I thought about the woman who'd packed those suitcases in the dark, terrified but determined. I thought about the year of legal proceedings, the divorce finalization, the slow rebuilding. 2 years felt simultaneously like forever, and no time at all. "I can't believe it's only been 2 years, I said. "It feels like a different lifetime." Because it was. The person I'd been in that marriage, constantly accommodating and shrinking and performing, felt like someone I'd known once but barely recognized now. I'd become someone new, or maybe someone old, the Sarah I'd been before I'd learned to make myself less. Work continued to fulfill me. The pediatric wing had become the hospital's pride, attracting patients from surrounding regions. I'd been asked to present our design process at a national nursing conference, sharing how we'd centered family needs in clinical space planning. The presentation terrified me. Public speaking had never been my strength, and imposter syndrome whispered that I had no business presenting at a national conference. But I prepared thoroughly, practiced relentlessly, and when I stood at that podium in front of 200 nursing professionals, I channeled every moment of hard-won confidence. The presentation went well. People asked questions, took notes, asked for my contact information to discuss similar projects at their institutions. Afterward, a nurse manager from Seattle approached me with an unexpected offer. "We're redesigning our entire children's hospital," she said. "Would you consider consulting on the project? It would require travel to Seattle monthly for about 6 months, but we'd compensate well." Old Sarah would have immediately thought of reasons to say no. New Sarah asked for details and said she'd consider it. That night in my hotel room, I thought about the offer. More work, more responsibility, more time away from home, but also more opportunity, more impact, the chance to influence pediatric care beyond my own hospital. I called Jennifer from the hotel, needing to talk it through. "What's holding you back?" she asked after I'd explained the opportunity. "Fear, probably," I admitted. "It feels big. What if I fail? What if I'm not actually good enough?" "Sarah," she said firmly, "you're standing in a hotel room after presenting at a national conference, being courted by a hospital in Seattle. You're good enough. The question is whether you want it." Did I want it? Sitting there in generic hotel decor, I realized I did. I wanted to push myself, to see what I was capable of, to use my skills and experience to make a difference beyond my immediate sphere. I accepted the offer the next day. The Seattle project became my focus for fall and winter. Monthly trips to the Pacific Northwest, working with teams of architects and administrators and medical professionals, designing spaces that would serve children and families with the same thoughtful approach we'd used in Asheville. The travel was exhausting, but energizing. I was good at this work, translating clinical needs and family experiences into physical design. I'd found a niche that combined my nursing background with project management and advocacy. If you're inspired by Sarah's continued growth and willingness to take on new challenges, please hit that subscribe button. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us share these stories of transformation and courage. Subscribe now and be part of this community. Between work trips and project demands, life in Asheville continued. The support group, now a fixture of my week. The hiking group, scaling mountains and building friendships. The cottage and gardens, requiring seasonal maintenance and care. Amanda and other young nurses, still needing mentorship. It was a full life, sometimes overwhelming, but full in a way that felt nourishing rather than depleting. Marcus's name popped up occasionally in unavoidable ways. Mutual friends would mention him in passing. Social media algorithms would suggest him as a connection. Each time, I felt less and less. Not anger anymore, not even really sadness. Just a distant recognition that he existed in a world separate from mine. I heard through the Charleston gossip network that he'd gotten engaged. Someone from his office, apparently. Someone who didn't challenge him the way I had. I felt a brief pang of something. Not jealousy exactly, maybe pity for her. But mostly I felt nothing, which felt like its own form of freedom. The 3rd anniversary of leaving approached as I prepared for another Seattle trip. 3 years since that night in the Charleston kitchen, since packing those suitcases, since choosing myself over a marriage that was erasing me. I marked it quietly, alone in my cottage with a glass of wine and my journal. I wrote about the journey, about the woman I'd been and the woman I'd become, about the hard-won lessons and the ongoing process of learning to trust myself. 3 years, a lifetime, a beginning.